Okay, so thanks for joining me tonight. I'm very sorry that we had to switch the time from tomorrow to today. I think my bandwidth was maxed out, and so I apologize to Jessica. We had some logistical problems, but I'm glad that you all were able to make the adjustment and come tonight. So what I'm thinking for tonight is really I want to walk through some of the basics of kind of thinking about graphic novels and what it takes to read them and what we gain by reading them in terms of our literacy skills. And the idea is that at any point in any time, per what I was just saying to Nancy, there's like, you can ask questions, you can chime in, because there's only 9 of us. I don't think you have to use the digital thumbs up or the digital hands. I think you can just unmute yourself and cough, and then the rest of us can stop talking and you can ask your question. So does that make sense for folks? Because we're such a small group. Okay. But you can also use the chat function. So if you've got questions or thoughts, you can put it in the chat, and I'll be monitoring it and Jessica will be monitoring it. Jessica, are you going to be here for the whole thing to monitor, or are you going to be going?
I'm going to stay. I'll keep an eye on the chat too.
So Jessica can also chat. So that makes sense for folks? Okay. So then my first question is, to kind of get us started, is how much experience do you have with graphic novels? So in the chat, to get used to the chat, you can just type your number in. So 1 being I've been reading them my whole life, a fair amount, some, not much, or none at all. So in the chat, why don't you give us the number of where you're at? All right, so 4s and 5s, 4s and 5s. Okay. Oh, Valencia, good. You're 2. Okay, good. So Valencia, you're going to be co-host then as we start to go through, because you've got a fair amount. That sounds good.
I have none.
You have none. It's okay. All right. So so I would say I've been a number 1. I've been reading them my whole life. I've been a comic book reader since I was a reader. So, when I was younger and people were like, oh, comic books rot your brain, I turned into a college professor. That doesn't mean that they didn't rot my brain, but it did not prevent me from having a job in functioning society. So, so the second question then is, how much experience do your students have with graphic novels? Okay, so in the same boat as you somewhat, right? That are you not sure? Okay. Right. So graphic novels certainly were more of a niche thing, 10 years ago or so, but they've really crossed over. If you go into any library, there's going to be a graphic novel section, or a growing graphic novel section. If you go to Barnes and Noble or your local independent bookstore, there's going to be a graphic novel section. So I feel like people have heard of them, but haven't necessarily read them themselves, or know that much about them. So the idea here is to kind of, introduce some of the key features of it and how you might use it in the classroom. So does that make sense okay, you can give me your analog thumbs up if that makes sense. Okay. All right, I see the analog thumbs up. Okay. So what is a graphic novel? So, and this is going to sound like a little bit of a wonky definition, but it's a long form piece of sequential art. So sequential art sounds like a fancy pants way of saying comic strip, right? And in some ways it is, right? But the whole idea of sequential art is that it's a series of images that tell a story. So not simply one painting, not simply one drawing, but a series of paintings, a series of drawings that tell a story. And they may have text or they may not have text, right? And if you think about this, human beings have been telling stories with images, long before they were telling stories with the printed word, right? So when we first started to communicate ideas, we did it with images that we wrote on cave walls, that we painted on cave walls, and those images would tell stories and share information. So graphic novels aren't introducing something new. It's actually touching something that humans have done as long as they've been communicating with each other. So sometimes people think of graphic novels as a fairly recent development. Every few years, someone makes an argument for the first graphic novel, right? So first it was like Mouse, which came out in the 80s. And then people were like, no, it's this, this Will Eisner thing that came out in the 70s. And now people are starting to make an argument for this book by Lind Ward, which came out in 1929. I'm guessing we're going to keep going back further in time. So this is what Lind Ward's work looked like. So each page was a woodblock print. So each page was a single woodblock print with no words. So looking at these three images, what do you think is going on here? How would you describe, if you were going to use language as opposed to images, how might you describe this passage of three images? You can either type it or you can unmute yourself and share. What do you think's going on here? So Lisa, you're saying it's man versus sea. Okay, so it's kind of this essential conflict. Pearlie, you're talking about a storm. Okay, and then as Andres points out, like at the end, there's the calm after the storm, right? So do these images and the feeling of these images remind you of any other sorts of texts or any other sorts of stories? Yeah, so the idea of weathering the storm, right? And that last panel, how has that man managed to weather the storm? What does that image give you a sense of? Yeah, so faith, right? So this looks like, stories of pilgrims. This looks like religious stories, right? So here's a man troubled out at sea in danger, he survives and he thanks a higher power, right? So this fits in with a long tradition of stories about people who think that they've survived because of divine intervention and because they've been faithful, right? So here's three images. And just with these three images, you were able to tell me things like weathering the storm, man versus sea, faith, all this sort of stuff. And these are the types of things your students can do as well, right? So a lot of people asked the question, oh, my student is at such and such a level, right? Our graphic novel is going to be too complicated for them and too difficult for them. So one answer is no, they're not, because if you have texts like this, people draw on their knowledge of the world, people draw on their own experiences, right? And they can tell you things about these images, right? And these can be the building blocks of the types of literacy skills that you want them to develop. So I would suggest that there's not a minimum level entry for readers for graphic novels as a whole. That being said, some of them are more complicated than others, just like any other form of writing, right? So as we're going to see, some may be a good fit for where your students are right now, and some might not be a good fit for them, right? But it's not because it's a graphic novel, it's because of the particular text that it is, right? We wouldn't give every student every novel, right? Or every poem or every play. So we need to be mindful and thoughtful of trying to connect our students to whatever text we're thinking about, okay? So another key thing to recognize at the start is that the graphic novel is not a genre, right? It's a platform or it's a form. Sometimes people say, oh, my students like, what genres do they like? Oh, they like graphic novels. That's like saying they like novels, right? And there's multiple genres. Do you like every novel? No, there's only certain genres that you like, right? So within graphic novels, you have lots of biographies or autobiographies. There's lots of nonfiction, lots of history, current events. There's an illustrated graphic novel version of the 9/11 report. Never read it. Don't understand why somebody would want to read it in graphic novel form, but somebody did that. There's science graphic novels. I have a really good one on evolution that really explains evolution in a way that's accessible. Of course, there's also fiction. There's drama, suspense, fantasy, comedy. So it has all of it. So what kind of genres do your students enjoy reading, hearing, watching? And anybody can share. You can also talk about yourself, like which genres you particularly like. So drama, okay. Probably your students like history, okay. So Andre, science and science. You guys can actually speak too. You don't have to. There's so few of us, but if you prefer, I know some people prefer typing, and that's okay. But also, like, we don't have to pretend that we're in a library right now, right? And I actually can speak. So, right. So
romantic comedy and horror sometimes.
yeah.
Horror.
So there's lots and lots of horror. There's lots and lots of graphic novels with horror. They put the graphic in graphic novel. And they're not really my cup of tea necessarily, but they are for some people, right?
What about nonfiction? Is there a graphic novel? Are there nonfictions?
Yeah, so there's lots of different types of nonfiction. So there's nonfiction for science. Like I said, there's evolution, there's history. I've seen some graphic novels on molecular biology. You know, so
For any events, yeah.
Entry level stuff for those sorts of things. So again, it's rather than just, if you're going into a graphic novel section, you really have to think about the genre and the topic, right? Because that's what's going to help you understand how to connect your student to the graphic novel itself. So Andres, there's lots and lots of sci-fi. You know, of course, there's lots and lots of science fiction comic books and things like that. But there's also sci-fi graphic novels as well. So,
what about current events? Like how would that work?
Yeah, so current events, because of the time lag, you know, it can't be breaking news, but you do have things that have like recent history,
Okay.
particularly around like biographies of, like, you know, somebody that might be a newsmaker within the last 5 years or so. There might be a graphic novel about them. If they're interested in comic art, there are comic artists online who do current events comments. So, you know, extended forms of political cartooning and that sort of stuff is available. There's a website called the Nib if you're interested in political cartoons, and the Nib has lots and lots of political cartoons. You know, some of them are really, you know, technically complex, and some of them look like somebody wrote it with their offhand. But you know, there's a whole real variety of those. So one of the things that I would suggest is that if you have a sense that your students may be interested in working with graphic novels, when you have an ability to, like, I mean, our local library, you can only go in for like a half an hour right now, but like to go into the graphic novel section and just kind of poke around. Your library is probably going to have a better graphic novel selection than your bookstore. You know, your local independent bookstore. I don't own stock in a local independent bookstore, so even though I keep saying that phrase, but I support my local independent bookstore, and I hope you do as well. They'll have a smaller sort of like you know, newer selection, but your library will have a much bigger selection. So definitely go and poke around and kind of see what's there. You can also go online and find things. You know, one way to start would be to look for yourself, to find a genre that you're interested in, to see if you can find graphic novels that fit your own tastes as a reader, to kind of get used to that. So I myself I like history. I like reading about history. So I do read historical graphic novels, nonfiction historical graphic novels. I almost never read biographies or autobiographies, although I read one recently. I don't know where I put it. I read one recently that's a biography of Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan when they're working together, and it's really effective because some of the art tries to capture Helen Keller's experience. So the panels will be black, and then you'll see her touching things and trying to make the connection between what she's touching and what Annie Sullivan's putting on her hand. So it's a really effective use of the medium. There's a lot of graphic novels out there that are boring. You'll see like a Shakespeare graphic novel, and it's basically stick figures with the dialogue. And it's like, if it's just the dialogue, I would just read Shakespeare, right? So like, if I'm reading a graphic novel, just give me something that uses the medium. So I would recommend that Helen Keller. If you're interested about that, send me an email and I'll send you the exact title, but it's quite good. Or I'll get it to Jessica and Jessica can pass it on, but I really recommend it.
I just have a quick question. Yeah. Let's see, I taught elementary school, so I'm familiar with graphic novels like Diary of a Wimpy Kid, you know, like the kid versions. I honestly did not really realize that you're talking about graphic novels for adults
Yeah.
or ones like middle school maybe and up, or
Most
like,
the ones I'm going to be talking about are for adults.
okay.
Yeah. So, and I wouldn't call, actually, this may sound a little picky, but I wouldn't call Diary of a Wimpy Kid a graphic novel.
They call it that. I
I
know.
know.
Yeah, go ahead.
because it's mostly text, right? And
Yeah.
then it's got a few illustrations thrown in there, right? So
Right.
same thing with like, well, Captain Underpants, I guess, has a little bit more drawings in it, but like,
Right.
it could
Wish.
basically kind of stand on its own.
Yeah.
But no, I'm not talking about Diary of a Wimpy Kid stuff. I'm talking about,
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I didn't really realize there
Yeah.
were ones for adults.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, good. I'm glad you're here because you're going to.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yep. All right. So if we're thinking about graphic novels, not only you have to think about what genre of novel or text your student might be interested in, you also have to think about kind of what style. So some graphic novels are wordy. So here's this graphic novel, Mouse. Have any of you heard of Mouse? No. All right. So Mouse is a story told by Art Spiegelman. He's a cartoonist. And it's about his dad's experiences surviving the Holocaust. And the way that it's represented is the Jews in the story are represented by mice. The Nazis are cats. And the US, people from the US are dogs. People from Northern Europe are deer, I think. And the Poles are pigs. And so you have these personifications of these different parts of the war. You know, clearly the mice and cat metaphors, you know, pretty spot on. And then people were worried and wondering, oh, why are the Poles pigs, right? And so, you know, from my understanding, Spiegelman made them pigs because like pigs, like the Nazis fattened them up until they were ready to slaughter them, right? And so so Spiegelman picked these things on purpose. But as you can see on the screen, there's a lot of words here, right? So my younger son, who hopes to be a graphic novelist himself someday, he doesn't even want to consider a Mouse a graphic novel because from his perspective, there's no pages that don't have words on them, right? And that the images are compelling, but they don't carry the story on their own. So here's Mouse. You can see for some of your students, this might feel too information dense, right? That there's just like too many words to move through, right? Or even just you as a reader, you might not like it because there's just too many words on the page, right? There's a lot of stuff to kind of work through. But if you're interested, and Mouse is interesting because he's interviewing his father about his father's experiences. So it goes back and forth in time, Spiegelman talking to his dad and then his dad's memory. And he and his dad have a fraught relationship, and his dad's finally sort of opening up near the end of the dad's life. So if you're interested in World War II, if you're interested in sort of family dynamic stories, it might be something that you want to check out. Lisa, you read it, you liked it. Do you want to say anything more about it?
Yeah, no, I thought it was excellent. I think I read it a while ago, but it's also interesting that it's a nice way if you're first introducing the Holocaust because it's I think a little less, it sounds weird to say graphic, but it's just, I think a softer introduction maybe is a good way to describe it. And it seems a little bit more accessible because it's in the graphic novel format.
Yeah. But it doesn't pull any punches in terms of like,
no,
you know, what happened and the scale of the genocide.
And I think, do they also have Mouse 2? I think there was a.
Yeah, so there's Mouse and Mouse 2, and sometimes they're published together.
Yeah.
But yeah. So no, I recommend it's, as I said earlier, a lot of people thought of this as the first graphic novel, but we keep going back in time and recognizing there were precursors. So there's also texts that are a little bit less wordy. So this is from a pair of books called Boxers and Saints. And it's by Jean Luen Yang, who's a graphic novelist. He wrote this book, American Born Chinese, which I think is one of the best I think it's one of the best American novels of the last 20 or 30 years. Sometimes younger kids read it, but I don't think it deals with internalized racism and the history of racism against Asian Americans. And I'm not sure that younger kids are actually prepared to read it and understand the nuances. But here he has this book, Boxers and Saints, and it's actually two books that come together. My camera's off. so you can't see me, but can you still see me on the side? All right, so it comes together as like a boxed set like this, and it's about the Boxer Rebellion in China, and one book is about the Chinese perspective, the indigenous Chinese perspective, and the other perspective is of somebody who was a converted Christian, and so each side of their in that fight. So it's quite good, and it's a historical novel, and you can see here, that this character, the main character, is being asked by one of his underlings, what should we do with them? And then he's like, they're all women and children. And then there's a pause, and the guy's like, this is like really difficult, right? So you can see here, compared to Mouse, this is much, much clearer and much more open than, it's not filled with text. It's not filled with lots of captions and word balloons. And then there's also graphic novels like the Lind Ward that have absolutely no text whatsoever. So there's this is a book for adults called Blood Song. And it's all just, it's in pictures, and it's very sort of monochromatic, right? And again, just like we did with the Lind Ward, looking at the picture on the left, I bet you can tell me what's going on here, right? So what do you see as taking place in this image on the left, the one in the middle?
Soldiers chasing a woman.
Yes. And what's the feeling you get from the color, from the art, from the illustration?
Very dismal.
Yeah, right. That blue and white sort of monochromatic stuff gives this feeling of being dismal, right? So here's an example. If your student was working with this, say you're working with an ESL student, and they're like, what does this make you think? What does this make you feel? They may not come up with the word dismal, but they may come up with similar words, and you can introduce words like dismal to get them to be able to describe this, right? So you can use these as opportunities to develop vocabulary, to talk about descriptive language, right? And things like that. Any other words that people might use to describe this image in the middle, or this page in the middle?
Scary, harrowing.
Yeah, scary, right? It is scary, right? So, and I think, Nancy, that's a good example, like scary and harrowing, right? So some of your students, whether they're ESL or not, like, all right, so maybe scary is a new word for them. If they already know scary, then harrowing could be the next word, right? So you can kind of build on these by talking about these sort of personal responses, right? And this is what we want people doing when they're reading, right? Is making these connections, reflecting, and sharing what they think. So the image on the right, what do you see going on here? Oops, sorry.
Well, he looks like a street musician, right? And the cops don't like it, like
Right.
that he's there, I guess.
Right. And what is that street musician doing? What feeling is that street musician conveying that you can understand by the illustration and the color scheme?
To me, he looks very joyful.
Right.
I was thinking jazz.
Yeah. So maybe
Yeah.
jazz, but he's why joyful?
Well, it's that yellow coming up and just the way he's leaning back, like that's all that's on his mind,
Right. Right. And that yellow is a very stark comparison to that sort of dismal and harrowing blue and white all around him. Right.
Mm.
So again, this is the type of work that we do when we're reading, right? We interpret texts that we're reading, right? We make inferences. So here we're making an inference about what the cops are doing, right? They're shutting down this guy sharing this joyful sound in this otherwise dismal and harrowing town, right? So this is the type of thing that your students can talk about regardless of where they are, right? In terms of their vocabulary development, in terms of literacy skills, right? The book is really interesting because it is mostly this sort of blue and white wash. It has some red, and then for when there's blood, and hence Blood Song. And there's actually some of this like when this comes in, right? So in addition to genre, right, we're thinking about, how much words we want in the text, right? Lots of them, some, or none. One other thing to think about is what you like in art, right? So here's a graphic novel biography of Zora Neale Hurston. I don't know if any of you are fans of Zora Neale Hurston. She wrote Their Eyes Were Watching God, Of Mules and Men. I love Zora Neale Hurston. And she was a complex and really interesting character as a person. And you can see here, Peter Baggy's art style. How would you describe this art style?
Happy.
It's happy. Okay. Any other ways you might describe this art style?
The facial expressions say a lot. I mean, that's a major focus, I think,
Yeah.
with each character.
Yeah. All right. So
Me-
now,
Yeah.
so-
I was just gonna say fluid, like, they look sort of real expandable, their faces.
yeah. So, I mean, speaking of expandable, in that third panel, like her arms are doing this impossibly stretchy, contorty thing, right? So, compare this art. So, yeah, Lisa's saying a bit of a caricature, right? Compare that art style to this art style, right? So, this is a memoir called Alan's War. This is about a U.S. soldier who served in France during World War II and then stayed. He ended up becoming an expat living in France. And you can see, and this is him talking about him and his soldier buddies roaming the French countryside, trying to get a fire to stay warm. And they're about to break this guy's furniture. And he's like, no, 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 no. So then they go out and they break his fence to start a fire, right? So you can see this, I would say, is, going for some realism, right? So this is a much more realistic portrayal of these characters compared to Peter Baggy's work, right? So just for you and the style of art that you like, I mean, you may like both, but do you have a preference for this kind of like exaggerated caricature cartoony, or do you prefer the sort of more sedate, mute neorealism as a reader?
Are you asking us?
Yeah. What do you prefer?
Yeah. I mean, as a reader, I would prefer the more realistic, but for my students, I think they would enjoy the cartoony.
Maybe, right? We'll have to ask them, right? Other folks?
I have a hard time with the font on the other one, like I don't like the font on the more cartoony. Yeah, I just don't like the font.
Right.
But I like the colors, and I like that this seems more alive, sort of.
Right. But I think that's a really important point, right? That like in addition to the color and the style, font matters, right? So
But we don't need to use the font, right? We can just use the figures.
No, you have to use the font. You have to read what's there, otherwise you're not going to know what's going on, right? So in this case, there's words, and there's words there for a reason, right? Because if you don't read these words, you don't know what the interaction is, right? So
you couldn't just ask your students, what do you think is going on here?
I wouldn't, because there's words to read, right? And so you'd want them to read it and then talk about what's going on, because the author's actually giving you text, right? So I think the size of the font and the style of the font also communicates things, right? Font, I mean, we know font communicates ideas, right? So what's your font? What's your work font? And what's your like personal font? I'm not asking that rhetorically. I'm actually asking you, like, what's your work font and what's your like more creative font?
Yeah, it depends upon your mood or what
Right.
you're thinking at the time,
Right.
or what you're producing it for.
Right. All those things go into your choice, and that's what a graphic novelist is thinking as well, right? They're going to choose a font to communicate a certain mood or style, right? So when I'm doing stuff for work, it's Times New Roman. When I'm doing stuff creatively, it's Baskerville. I'm a Baskerville guy. I like Baskerville. And some people hate Times New Roman because it seems so cold and like, I don't know, like institutional, but it seems clean to me, right? So I think Marion's point about like, yeah, so you may like the style of art, but the font may be an issue for you, right? Because either the size or the style. So here, right, the font matches in some ways, the font matches the art, right? It's straightforward, it's kind of clean, it looks a little bit like type, right? So these are all things that we need to think about when we're, working with students, right? So when we're beginning to think about what text we might want to use, we can think, okay, so we're not just going to say, oh, it's, pick a graphic novel and just read any graphic novel, right? We wouldn't do that with any other book, right? So we want to say, what's the theme or the topic that you're interested in? Is it sci-fi? Is it rom-com? Is it horror, right? Is it humor? So think about the text topic, think about the text theme. Also think about the style, how many words, and what the preference is, right? For the number of words, for the style, for the font, the color. And then just initially from this discussion, we can think about the ways that graphic novels might be used, right? So they might be used for independent reading, right? So things that your students are just reading on their own. They may be useful for partner reading. I don't know how often you do partner reading with your students, right? Where you trade off. I read a page, you read a page, I read a page, you read a page, right? And in addition to reading the text, you'd be able to comment on what you see, what you're thinking. Clearly, you can use them as vehicles and starters for discussion and description. You can use them as writing prompts, right? So when you read this, what are you thinking? What questions does it raise for you? And then just from this initial part of the discussion, other ideas that you have for how you might end up using graphic novels with your students?
So like, what do you see here? Like that you were saying.
Okay, like so having conversations about what they see,
Yeah.
and kind of talking about those. Okay.
And maybe, yeah, I mean, I guess this is discussion and description, but maybe have them after they read independently, then having them summarize, summarize
Right.
what they read and predict and those kinds of, we're drawing inferences. I mean, a lot of those kinds of
All
skills.
the skills that we work on already, right? In terms of trying to summarize and inference and do these types of things. The interesting thing about you working with graphic novels, right? So when somebody's writing something, a summary, or they're making an inference, we ask them where in the text they have evidence for that, right? So where do you see that? And in this case, they can draw on both the words that are there and also the images that might be there, right? To be like, I know this because look at this character's face. Look at Zora Neale Hurston's face in this panel. She's really angry. I can tell she's angry because of this, what's happening with her face, right? So they have to use the same sort of textual evidence that we want them to use in any other types of reading. Okay, so, right, and so Lisa's saying to introduce a topic, right, as a way into a topic. So clearly, like, I'm pro graphic novel, right? And I think that it does a lot of things that we want them to do with the students that we're working with. All right, at the same time, there are things about graphic novels that are in fact complicated, right? And so I want to go through some of those. So for example, one of the things that you have to develop as a skill is being able to manage the image and the text, right? So for those of you, most of you put 4 or 5, right, at the beginning of this session about how much experience you have. So when you look at this panel, take a look at this panel for a second and then see if you can kind of monitor what your eyes do or the way that you process this page. And do you notice anything about kind of how you work with this page? What do you do first? And what do you do?
My eyes went first to the text.
Okay.
And then I tried to make sense of what's going on based on from the words.
Okay. So you read all the text first and then
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So you read the title, Chechen War, Chechen Women, Going Home, and then kind of going down the page.
Yes.
Okay.
And then once I read, then I'm looking at the different details inside the
Okay.
drawings. Yeah.
All right. Anybody else do something different than Andres?
Yes, I looked at the characters first.
Okay.
I looked at the title, and then I was obviously drawn to the main character that's there.
Okay,
And then I looked at the others, and that in itself said so much, just her face.
right.
And then I looked at the text.
All right, so you started with the character that's kind of foregrounded,
Yeah.
then the title, and then that way. All right. Anybody else? Any other options and kind of how you did this?
No, I think focus on the woman first and then the title, and then your eye kind of follows down.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so none of those are wrong, right? Those are all different ways to interact with this page, but they're all slightly different, right? But to go back to the point that Perla was going to make, yeah, you have to read all of them, right? So
Mhm.
you can't just look at this image and then move on, right? There's words here to interact with. And it's easy to get lost, right? Or it's easy to feel disoriented if you're not used to this. The fact that you need to toggle back and forth between text and image. Because I've been reading these since I've been like 5 years old, in some ways I would suggest to you that I actually read them both at the same time. That like, as I was reading the words, I was taking the image in almost simultaneously. But that's just because I've been reading these for a long time. And I can't do that with every image, but in this case here, right? So, so you may have a student, if they've never read comics, if they've never read graphic novels, they may need to work through this process of balancing the text and the image. One thing that you don't want to do, and some of my master's students do this occasionally, they'll tell me, they'll read all the words throughout a book and not look at the images and then say, I don't understand what the book was about. And I'm like, because you didn't look at the images. Or they'll look at all the images and not look at the words and say, I don't know what the book was about, right? But each page is designed to be read and analyzed on its own, right? So you're not going to flip ahead and then come back. So each page, you're going to be like, here's the text, here's the image, and I need to think about both of them, okay? The Joe Sacco here, for those, this kind of goes back to the current events question. Joe Sacco calls himself a graphic journalist. And what he does is he goes to parts of the world and he embeds as any journalist would, and then he writes about it. So here you can see he was embedded in Chechnya, right? So he was there during the Chechen War in the 90s. He's got a book about Palestine where he lived in Gaza for like 3 months. And so that he writes about living in Gaza in a form of graphic journalism. So if you like the news, if you like current events and politics, then Joe Sacco is your person. He also has a really interesting book that came out a couple years ago called The Great War. So it's about World War I, and it folds out to being one 24-page mural.
Mm.
And it goes from the front line of World War I to the generals making the decisions far away from the front line. And each panel has a continuous image, and it really gets you into World War I history. It's really, really cool if you like war and that kind of, not if you like war, nobody likes war. If you like reading about war and you're interested in reading about war, then it's good that way. All right, so clearly, yes, reading graphic novels demands some specific things that you don't get in regular text, right? I would say even a Diary of a Wimpy Kid, it's not that complicated, right? Because it's like, here's some text and then here's a stick figure of Rowley like eating some popcorn or something, right? And then it goes on to the next thing, as opposed to being combined and integrated, right? And this is much more complicated than Diary of a Wimpy Kid. Okay, the other thing when reading graphic novels and sequential art is the work that the reader has to do. So some of this work comes from a book called Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud, which is an influential book. So take a look at that first panel on the left and then the panel on the right. So what happens? What's happening here?
He's being killed
How do you know he's being killed?
because it appears in the second panel that he's crying out in pain.
So you're making the inference that the guy going, yeah, in the second panel is the one that was going, no, no, in the first panel.
Yeah.
That he hasn't managed to disarm his attacker and then turn the track. All right. So I would agree with you. I think that he unfortunately probably has been attacked by that big axe wielding maniac, right? But in that second panel, it doesn't say that, right? So that's an inference that you're making as a reader that that's what's happened. So what Scott McCloud, he's a comic artist himself, he refers to that white space between the two panels as the gutter, right? Think about it as like the gutter on the house or the gutter in the bowling alley, right? And what we as readers do is we connect those, right? We tie those two images together, and we have to do that inferencing work because the second panel doesn't say, and then he was killed, right? Or then he was attacked with the axe. So as readers, we're making that inference and pulling them together. So here, this is fairly straightforward. I mean, you know, there's a guy in an axe in the first one, guy screaming in the second one. But you can see where in other graphic novels, it may be a little bit more subtle in terms of how it goes from one panel to another panel. And McCloud suggests that there's lots of different types of ways that we can bring closure. He talks about closing this gap, right? So sometimes it's from one time period to another, one location to another, one character perspective to another, right? But as readers, we're pulling this work together. Do you see what does this make sense, kind of what he's saying, the inferencing that we have to do as readers, right?
Mm-hmm.
So here, he points out something interesting that goes on with graphic novels and sequential art here. So take a look at the one on the top. And what do you think's going on? And this is clearly before the 2004 when my Red Sox finally won the World Series, right? So now I've run it 4 times this century. So I don't want to rub it in, but I'm a Red Sox fan. So what do you think's going on in this? What do you think's maybe interesting in this first strip? How is he using the medium here to communicate something and have you as a reader make an inference? What's the mood here? Or what's the feeling here?
The person that he's talking to is really not interested.
Right. And so how long does he take to answer?
A while.
A while. How do you know it's a while?
Because there are 3 panels, and then eventually in the 4th panel, he answers.
Right. So the 3 panels of the same image gives you this sense of duration, right? It gives you this, like, you're waiting, and then he finally gives you that answer, right? So again, as a reader, you have to make this inference, right? And if you're not used to interpreting images this way, you might be confused and going, why isn't the guy saying anything, right? Mm-hmm. Similarly, look at the one below it. Right? So how does he accomplish that same feeling here? Do you notice anything interesting in this one?
Well, it looks like deserve. We would think of it as being like is italicized, right? Like
he's stressing it. Like, I deserve a better job. I could be a brain surgeon. But how does he communicate that mood of waiting and duration, even though there's only one image here?
The space between each block is wider.
Yeah. Right. The gutter, he's increased the size of the gutter, and that increased gutter size gives you that feeling of duration. This is incredibly subtle, right?
Yeah.
The difference between the panels communicates a different feeling, right? So I would suggest that this is, evidence that the idea that graphic novels by definition are easy reads is simply mistaken, right? It demands complex reading skills that not everybody necessarily has, right? Whether it's the duration, the repetition of a single image, or whether it's varying the width of the dimensions between panels to communicate information, right? Or to go back earlier, what is the font saying, right? What is the style of art saying? All of these things are coming together to communicate an idea, to communicate a mood, a question. So it's not like, okay, this is easy reading. It's not training wheels, right? So if students are reading this, it's because they're interested, in the form, they're interested in the topic, right? And it's challenging for them, and it feels like it's consistent with what they want to do as a reader, not just like, here, read this because it's an easy comic book, right? Similarly, all right, some of the demands of graphic novels is how the page itself is oriented. So this is a page from Jimmy Corrigan, World's Smartest Boy. So take a second to read this. It's a little bit smaller than it would be in real life, although not much. And kind of monitor yourself as you make your way across this page and how you manage this page.
I don't know if others can, but I can't actually see the words.
No.
Yeah,
I'm
don't worry
very
about
hard.
don't
Too
worry about the
small.
words. Yeah, don't worry about the words so much.
Okay.
In the book, it's small too. You have a sense of how to read this?
I don't think it's as clear as some of the others we've seen.
Right,
A little confusing.
right.
Is it top to bottom? Is it? No, I don't know.
So it's left to right and top to bottom. So you can see my cursor, right? I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
So it goes from here to here to here, here,
Ah.
here, then to here, then like this, then over here, and then down, and then over, and then here, 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 and then here. Right? So
Wow.
traditional text that you're used to reading, left to right, top to bottom, right? Boom, boom, boom. Piece of, corn on the cob, da 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 da, right? But here you need to orient yourself to a different sort of flow. This could be this might have been challenging for you, so this might be challenging for your students as well, right? If they're not used to this type of text, and you wouldn't want to give this to them without talking about how one reads this kind of page, right? Because then it might reinforce their own ideas about, well, I'm not a good reader, I don't know how to do this stuff. No, it takes skills that not everybody has because they haven't done this type of reading before, right? Just like anything, you need to learn how to read it, right? You have to learn how to read a book. You have to learn how to read a graphic novel. You have to learn how to read a credit card bill, right? All these different genres have different demands of them, right? If you like being sad and depressed, and I know some of you do, then I would recommend Jimmy Corrigan, World's Smartest Boy. If you don't like being sad and depressed, I would stay away from this book. Chris Ware is really sort of an avatar of what's called miserableism, right? And it's just sort of like wallowing in sort of misery. Quite graphically complex and interesting. He also made he did something a couple years ago called Apartment Stories, and it's basically you build a house out of paper that's pre-made, and it tells a story by putting the house together and the residents of the house. It's really fascinating way of thinking about telling a story. All right, so of course the other thing in graphic novels is that you have to interpret the image, which we've spent a little bit of time doing already. But here, take a look at this image and then tell me what you think is going on, particularly in that third panel.
Did he fall asleep?
He did not fall asleep, but that's
No.
that's a good guess. Why did you think he was sleepy?
Because he was sitting up here and now his head is on his arm on the
Uh-huh.
on the sofa,
Yeah, and his eyes are kind of
closing.
half closed.
I see him staring at the wall, and finally we get to see the wall.
Yes, exactly. I agree with Perla. I think that's what's going on, right? He's staring at the wall, and then we finally see the wall. So, what's his mental state?
Daydreaming.
Yes, is it a nice daydream or not a nice daydream?
A nice one.
Nice one.
Not a nice one.
Not a nice one.
It's not a nice daydream, right?
No.
So what's going on here is he's in Oakland, and the woman that he loves, who he has not told her that he loves her, has moved to New York City. So he's pining after her. He's sitting on this couch and daydreaming, right? So imagine you were going to write this. You would say, Jimmy, Jimmy's on the couch. I forget what the woman's name is. He's thinking about Sheila. I don't know, Sheila. So Jimmy's thinking about Sheila. You know, he can't think about anything else except for Sheila, and he ends up staring at the wallpaper. Now, I'm not a very good writer, and that's a really bad passage, right? But compare that to this image, right? And that third image, how well does it capture his mind state, right? That you just see the wallpaper itself that he's just kind of staring at, right? So all of a sudden, like, you get it, right? You get how narrow his worldview is right now, and he really can't think of anything else. So there's no language here, but it brings you into his experience and his mind state, right? But, the first interpretation that was shared was that he's asleep, right? And making inferences from there because of, maybe that's like he's fuzzed out or whatever it might be. With more context, you might have thought that he was daydreaming, right? But that's the work of interpretation, right? Is what you have to do here. This book is really interesting. Also, everything that's in Oakland is in kind of this pink wash color scheme, and everything in New York is in blue. And it jumps back and forth in time, but it never tells you that it's going back and forth in time with words. It just tells you it in color, right? So anytime it's in red or pink, it's in the past in Oakland, and in New York, it's in blue, right? So it's a very interesting inference to make.
Who's the author?
Jason Shiga. He's actually a librarian in Oakland, so he writes about that. He recently got a big grant. He wrote this book called Meanwhile, which is kind of like this book for kids, not so much for young kids, where it's like make your own path kind of book. And he's working on one for adults where it opens up both ways. So it's going to be really complicated, pick your own path. So I think Empire State is the best of his work to kind of check out. He's got this other book called Demon, which is long and full of horror and graphic violence that I think loses the plot, which is unfortunate because it's like 800 pages long. So that's a long amount of pages to lose the plot. But I think Empire State is pretty good. Okay, so similarly, here's another example of like the work that we do as readers thinking about interpreting the image. So I don't know, those of you who know who Robert Moses was, kind of as a historical figure, and if you don't know who Robert Moses was, what do you think you can tell about Robert Moses from the cover of this biography of him, just on the basis of the images, of the image?
That he was a big shot.
Right, he's a big shot. How do you know he's a big shot?
Because he's bigger than the buildings.
Right. So he's kind of looming over the buildings. What else do you think you know about Robert Moses from this image?
I would think that he was, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, he's obviously responsible for much of the structure of New York, buildings, the roads, the bridges.
Right, because he's overlooking those, and here's the examples of those. Yeah. What else?
I was just going to say city planning or architecture, or I mean, that's what I would think just looking at that.
Mm-hmm. What does this suggest about his character?
He's intense, maybe.
Okay.
He's an American? Probably.
He's American because he's got the flag in his office. Okay.
He's used to being in power.
Right. Anything else?
I see it. His visions are all encompassing. He's not just looking at one, a highway or a bridge. He's looking at in totality everything.
Okay. Anything else about him? Where did he work, or how did he get his work done? Where is he in this image? Do you see a clear picture of his face?
No.
No, because why?
He's in the shadows.
He's in the shadows,
Sorry.
right? So what does this suggest about how Moses went about his business?
He's shady.
He's shady. He's literally in the shade. Say that again, Andres?
like the mob, like he works with.
Yeah, has a feeling of kind of has a feeling of the mob, right? So for those of you that know Robert Moses' history, he was never elected to any really powerful position, right? But he got himself on like 25 different commissions, and he cobbled together power behind the scenes, right? And so he built the bridges, he built the highways. He wanted to build a highway through Harlem, right? Without asking the people in Harlem whether they wanted a highway through Harlem, which they would have said no, right? So this gives you an image of how Moses worked. All those things that you said are there, right? He's powerful. He built all this infrastructure, but he's kind of shady, right? And he kind of operates in the shadows. So you get all of that just from the image before you even start to read this text, right? So that's all there. Okay. So what are the implications then? So one, as I think you hopefully would agree with me, is that reading graphic novels can be complicated, right? Whether it's, understanding what it's saying about Moses, understanding how to read the page in Jimmy Corrigan, right? Or interpreting what Jimmy's feeling, when he's pining away in Oakland, right? And that there are some unique demands for reading graphic novels, right? So you may be a veteran reader of really, really complicated, 18th century English novels, right? And graphic novels you would struggle with, right? Because you're not used to the way that they're structured. You're not used to the format that they use. You're not used to the resources that they use. So clearly they're not just simply easy reads, right? You're not just going to toss it on a student's desk. It's not Captain Underpants. It's not Diary of a Wimpy Kid, right? And so they need to be selected as mindfully as any other text that you would select for your student, right? You can't just grab any graphic novel and toss it to your students. So any other, before we move on to the next area, any other thoughts that you have about kind of what you're seeing in terms of the nature of reading graphic novels and the specific skills that graphic novels require?
Okay, well, I was just,
Okay.
oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that to me, this is like really exciting. Actually, this is really exciting just because, I've moved from, teaching little kids for a long time, and I'm working with some adult English language learners now, and I knew that my toolbox wasn't going to work, like necessarily. And so for me, because you take all those skills, just that, with higher material or more appropriate material for the adults, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really exciting. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. So I think that's actually a good segue to thinking about the types of skills that you are already working on, right? That we sort of traditionally work on in the adult education classroom. So for example, setting, right? So we're always asking students to think about the setting of what they're reading, right? And what they see in what they're reading that helps establish that setting. So this is actually a friend of mine's novel, graphic novel, Take What You Can Carry. And it goes back and forth in time between a young Japanese American man who's interned in Manzanar, in one of the Japanese internment camps, and a younger kid that kind of messes with his stuff, and then they have to come together. So thinking about setting, what is these images here? How does it evoke the setting of Manzanar? What could you say about the setting here?
Stark.
It's dark.
No, stark.
Not a happy place.
Oh, stark. Not a happy place, right?
Remote.
Right. It's out in the middle of the Sierra Nevadas, right? So Japanese Americans were taken from LA, San Francisco, these temperate coastal cities, and put out in the middle of the desert in Sierra Nevadas. All right. So you get a sense here, right? So the setting matters to this story. It's not just any place, but setting has a crucial part of the story, right? It's in the internment camp and it's about the internment camp, right? So setting matters. Okay.
I think, may I just, on that last one, I think what's most interesting is that as you progress, you get closer into the picture and
Right.
the focus. And to me, I mean, in the first scene, it's just to me a very remote place. And then on the second, you suddenly see this little figure by the fence. And
Right.
then obviously in the third and fourth, it becomes very clear what's happening.
Right.
But I think that approach is very interesting.
Right. It gives you how big this space is, how
Mhm.
remote this space is, and then it narrows down what must it be like to be this man in this big remote kind of open space. My friend Kevin did an interesting, he said he made a choice when he was making this novel, actually, was that all the scenes in Manzanar are wordless, because he felt like he was not Japanese American, he's not an immigrant. He couldn't find the language that he felt like was respectful and really could capture that experience. So then he left that wordless and made the contemporary stuff tell that part of the story with words. But this part he made wordless because he was like, I'm not that, and I can't really tell that story. All right. So then we also think about sequencing, right? So what happens in a story? So this is a book called Chicken with Plums by Marjan Satrapi. She's an Iranian graphic novelist. She wrote a book called Persepolis, which was turned into a movie. And it's about her own experiences in the Iranian Revolution in the 70s and the early 80s. And then this is a much smaller book. It's kind of a side book about her uncle's experience, and he was a musician. And I think it's hard to see up here. The resolution's not great, but this first page says like 1 week later, the next page says 1 month later, right? So we're thinking about how time is passing, and then also what happens in each scene, right? So this is something that readers have to do regardless of the type of story they're reading, right? What order is the story being told? How do I understand that order? Sometimes we have stories that have flashbacks, right? Or go back and forth in time, right? So graphic novels do that as well, just like regular traditional novels do. We can also think about characterization. We were doing that with Robert Moses. Here's a biography of Roberto Clemente for any of you that are baseball fans or sports fans. Roberto Clemente was a great baseball player, humanitarian. He died bringing a relief to people in Nicaragua after an earthquake. He was in a plane that was bringing supplies, and it crashed into the ocean, unfortunately, right? But so just like with any novel or any story, we can think about characterization. So looking at that cover compared to Moses, what can you tell me the author is trying to suggest about Clemente here with this cover image?
I see a very kind face.
Mm-hmm. Yep. What else do you see? What else do you think it might suggest about Clemente as a person?
Strong and capable.
Yeah. Yes, I would agree. And I think, Paul, I think that those adjectives also, you can see those adjectives at play here, Clemente in the field, right? Here goes Clemente catching this ball, throwing the ball in, right? So I think strong and capable. Anything else you see the author here suggesting about Clemente?
To me, it looks sort of forward-looking or hopeful, just his profile and looking up a little bit, or just his head up a bit.
Yeah, he's head up. He's looking straight forward. His head's not down. Right? The other thing that I think here is interesting is the color scheme. It sort of captures the pirates' colors, right? The pirates' uniform. And then also, we were speaking before about the font. Here, if you look at the word balloons on the second side, what kind of feeling do these word balloons give you? They're not just rectangles.
Soft. They're very soft.
They're soft.
Well, you focus in on them very quickly because of the color.
Right. What about the shape?
I think they look loud.
You think they look loud because of the contrast? Because they're popping out? Yeah.
I think they're also irregular.
Right. So what does that irregularity do kind of for the mood or for the feeling?
I think it kind of keeps you on your toes.
Yeah. I think it's a little jazzy, right? I think it's got a little flavor, a little style, right? And I think one of the things that he tries to get across in the novel is that not only was Clemente a great player, but he had a certain panache, right? That's why people liked Clemente. He had a panache, and I think the even the word balloons here have a certain panache to them, right? Like it wouldn't make sense just to kind of have a rectangle. Then Clemente went back and cut it, arriba, right? Like
Yeah.
that'd be kind of
Yeah.
boring, right? But here it gives you like a flavor of Clemente. Okay, so these are all the things, you know, these are all the things that we want students doing as readers already, right? Thinking about the setting, thinking about sequencing, thinking about characterization, making these inferences, and then having these personal responses, right? So, you know, oh, it's loud, right? Why do you think it's loud? Oh, because it looks this way. And how does it, you know, are you happy that it's loud, or is it off-putting that it's loud? Like, is it pleasing that it's loud, right? So these are all the things that we want students doing. And more importantly, that's what they want to be doing, right? As readers, they wanted to be able to develop these skills so that they can really make meaning and enjoy these texts, okay? So big picture, graphic novels bring with them their own demands and own opportunities because they're a particular type of text, but they also provide an opportunity to work on the skills that we're working on with other types of texts, right? So it's not time off task if we're thinking about a literacy class or an English class or whatever it might be. It's all on task, right? It's all on task, but we have to choose the text wisely because it has to fit student interest, student preferences, you know, and student styles, okay? So any other thoughts about kind of connecting this to other work that you're already doing kind of on traditional or typical literacy skills?
One of the things that's kind of interesting to me, and I'm sorry I came a little bit late, but you know, children read picture books because the pictures provide a context that helps them understand the language. And so I think it's really exciting to think that, you know, that the graphic element of the graphic novels can provide that same kind of context to help a basic literacy reader, you know, figure out what a particular word might be because of that context.
Right. Good ones, right?
Good ones.
Good ones again, right? So I agree with what Helen's saying. A good graphic novel, the art is going to complement the text, you know, support the meaning making, support your understanding of those words. A bad one is, again, just going to be like, here's a stick figure standing in the middle of nowhere, like doing nothing with color or perspective or proportion or any of this stuff. You might as well just have the words, right? If it's not giving you any added information visually, right? But when it gives you that added information visually, then all of a sudden things can click, right?
Mm.
Things can really click. Other thoughts about how this connects to things that you think maybe as more traditional literacy skills?
I totally agree with Ellen, and Marianne as well mentioned it. And a personal example is I had to learn English as a second language when I was 10 years old. And I remember being in 4th grade, and the article that we had to read was all about a backyard. It had told us about the insects and the flowers, and I still couldn't make the connection of what a backyard was until somebody took me by the hand and took me outside and showed me what a backyard was.
Right.
So if we can make that connection with our students with graphics, I think it's really going to make it click.
Yeah. I think not only is that true in fiction, but it's also true in nonfiction, right? So if you're reading, you know, about evolution, or you're reading about history, or you're reading about somebody's journey and it shows them moving across a map, sometimes it's easier to start to understand the spatial relations and what information you can get from a map, right? Not everybody can read a map well, right? That's also another specific type of literacy skill. Maps are not self-explanatory. You have to understand the conventions of maps to be able to work with them well, right? And so sometimes a graphic novel may help you understand the conventions of a map by showing a character interacting with that map. Okay. All right. The last point that I want to make is that that graphic novels, you know, rely upon these general literacy skills, and they help develop those skills. And as I've been suggesting, we can be explicit about this, right? Like when we're pointing out to students how these work, or how you can work with them, and not simply think that they're going to pick it up on their own, right? There's some things that you picked up on your own, but there's lots of things that you picked up because your parents told you how to do it, or a sibling told you how to do it, or a friend told you how to do it, right? You learned from other people how to use those different type of texts. So the last thing that I want to touch on just briefly is the idea of using text sets. And I don't know how often you do this, right? But text sets are when you grab a couple of books or stories that are related, either same theme, same topic, same kind of questions that they're wrestling with. And they may be sort of explicit in how these books connect to each other, and sometimes it's a little bit more implicit, right? But what I would suggest is sometimes these text sets offer you a chance to have really deep conversations about questions that your students care about, right? And that you also care about. So here's an example text set, right, that I think works. So here's the question, right? So what's the proper response to systemic racism and white supremacist ideology? Unfortunately, an evergreen question in this society, and certainly apropos of this current moment, right? Here's 3 different graphic novels that answer this question in very different ways, okay? So on the far right is a book by John Lewis, right? And does everybody know who John Lewis was? Anybody not who John Lewis was? Can somebody explain who John Lewis was?
John Lewis started in civil rights as a very young person, and gradually became a member of the establishment in a way. I think he was a member of the House for years and years from, I'm not sure where, Alabama, maybe, Georgia?
Yeah, Georgia, I think.
Georgia.
Yeah, Georgia. And so March is about the March on Selma, and so famous for being nonviolent, right? So with Martin Luther King Jr. And using nonviolence as a method, right? Using nonviolence as a method to protest, okay?
Nonviolent on one side.
Yes, nonviolent on one side, right? So yes, but facing violence, responding to violence with nonviolence, right? So that was the strategic choice, was we're going to face this violence on the part of the police and the state with nonviolence. On the left, here's a graphic novel about Nat Turner. So Nat Turner's, so everybody not know who Nat Turner is? Okay, so anybody want to explain who Nat Turner was? People know who Nat Turner was?
Nat Turner led a slave revolt, possibly the most savage and successful, at least in the short run, during the pre-Civil War days, and was, I think he was hung along with the Confederates.
Yes. So yeah. So Nat Turner was an enslaved person, and he met the violence of slavery with violence, right? So in the graphic novel of Nat Turner, you see the revolt. You see them fighting for their liberation through violence, right? And it means that they kill people that were enslaving them. They kill kids. They kill anybody that's in their way, right? So Nat Turner, how do we respond to violence? We fight violence with violence. John Lewis, how do we respond to violence? We respond to violence with nonviolence. Frederick Douglass, why do I have Frederick Douglass in the middle of these two? For those of you that know,
he won it with words. He was like an educator, is that right?
He was, yeah, he was an educator. Anybody with other knowledge of Frederick Douglass's?
Well, he was with John Brown, but he did not actually take part.
Yeah, so John Brown invited him, come with me to Harper's Ferry and take up arms, and Frederick Douglass said no. So in that moment,
he was enslaved.
Yep.
And he won his freedom, but he was a very famous orator, and he spoke, a very famous abolitionist.
Yes, he's a very famous abolitionist. So when John Brown invited him to take up arms, he said no, right? I'm going to take this nonviolent path. But there's other times in his life when Frederick Douglass was like, actually, when faced with this type of violence, maybe violence is the right response, right? So in Frederick Douglass's life, he wrestled with what the response was. Do I do nonviolence or do I do violence, right? So if you take these three texts together, you have one person that has one strategy, you have one person that has another strategy, and then you have one person that goes back and forth and wrestles with how he thinks, right? So by reading these together, then you can actually have like a conversation about this theoretically, like strategically, what are the different ways that people address this, right? And, you know, people are doing this on a daily basis in the United States, or how do we deal with systemic racism? Not everybody has the same strategy, right? Not everybody has the same answer or response. And if we're going to treat our students, our adult learners, as adults and treat ourselves as adults, we can actually have that conversation, right? So this is far, far, far away from Diary of a Wimpy Kid, right? This is reading for the reason that we read, right? We read because we want to understand the world. We read because we want to understand ourselves. We read because we want to understand how we can affect the world. But we're going to come to different conclusions, right, about how to do that. And so if we read text sets, we can see these different perspectives and then have a conversation about these different perspectives, right? So I think this is the power of text sets, right? So you can bring them together. This is one text set. You can have another text set about, you know, say the experiences of women or the experiences of immigrants, the experiences of kids, right? Responses to the environment, you know, whatever it might be. Think about like, if you're think about to go back to Maus, Art Spiegelman has a really fraught relationship with his father. They just can't communicate with each other, right? So imagine putting a text set together about parents and children's relationships and their ability to communicate with each other, right? You can have one book that is about a parent and a child who are completely simpatico, right? Like they're on the same page, they understand each other, they can speak to each other. You might have a book where a parent and child just like butt heads, they can't communicate, and another one where it kind of goes back and forth, right? So then you can compare and contrast the experience that those parents are having, that those children are having, right? And if your student is a parent, they can say, well, my experience with my child is more like this or more like this, right? And you can kind of share those things. So rather than just going from one book to another, kind of in a siloed fashion or an ad hoc fashion, if we organize things together in forms of text sets, we can really deepen the conversation that we're having, right? Again, following the student's lead, I'm not going to go on Monday morning and say, hey, students, let's talk about like how we're going to respond to systemic racist violence, right? But if that's something that we've been talking about, then it'll grow out of that, right? I'm not going to like bring it to a student who has no idea why I'm bringing it to them, right? I'm building on conversations that we've had. I'm building on interests that they've expressed through conversations that we have, right? So kind of big picture, we choose these because students are interested in the topics, they're interested in the questions, they may be interested in the format, and then we have to do the legwork, right? We have to do the legwork as teachers and tutors and instructors to figure out what's going to work on the basis of the style, on the basis of the format, on the basis of the content, on the basis of the questions it's going to raise, right? So it offers, I think, a lot of potential, right? But we have to do it mindfully, like we do with any sort of text, okay? So that's a lifetime of reading comic books and graphic novels and teaching with them in a nutshell. So oops, sorry, I don't know why I went this backward. Sometimes this doesn't want to behave. All right, so any other thoughts that you have kind of about the nature of graphic novels, how you might use graphic novels, what hurdles might present themselves to kind of work with them? And moving forward, I'm always happy, you know, if you send me an email and you want a recommendation, I'm happy to give you a recommendation, right? So The recommendation can't just be like, I want a graphic novel for my student. Then I don't have an answer for you, right? But if you say, I have a student that's really interested in US history in the, 18th century, and they like lots and lots of colorful pictures. All right, I can try to find something, right? Then
Can you give us your email?
yes. So yeah, I'll put it in the chat.
Do you have any graphic novels on immigrants, immigrant stories, low level? I teach low level. That you can think of, just if you can't now, it's okay. Research it.
Yeah, I know that there's some. I've seen some graphic novels that kind of deal with Ellis Island, like the experience of going through Ellis Island. I can take a look and see what I can find.
Yeah, I can look too. I
Yeah.
just thought maybe.
Yeah, but there's definitely stuff out there.
I mean, the least amount of words is helpful for my
Yeah.
level, I think.
Yeah.
To build vocabulary, build conversation.
Yeah. And I'll take a look as well, though, because that's something that I'm interested in. I'm interested in kind of immigrant stories.
Oh, they're so
have-
wonderful, wonderful stories.
I have a kind of a process question, which I'm sorry if you answered this before, but most of us are meeting remotely now, and do you, if I were going to use a graphic novel with my student, would you recommend that we both get a copy of it? And or is it possible, even if we both have a copy, when we come together, are there electronic versions that you can show on the screen? Because a lot of what we do now is, I'll put up a document and and we read it together.
Yeah, there are electronic copies, not for every graphic novel, but both libraries often have electronic versions of it that can be used with e-readers or to be downloaded as PDFs. There is a library feature called Hoopla. I'm not sure if your library has it, but it's HOOPLA. And Hoopla has access to comic books and graphic novels that you can access digitally. I think, and then there's also some publishers that you can access it electronically as well. But I might start with Hoopla and poking around your library to see what electronic copies they have.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep. And then if you want to start slow, you could also get a copy yourself and scan a page and then send a PDF of that scanned page to your student. Right. So
yeah, that's a good idea.
So there's some graphic novels, or there's some graphic novels out there that have like short stories in them. So rather than one big novel, it has a short, it might have a 10 or 12 page short story. So you could scan that short story and then forward that to your student. I think technically that's a violation of the law.
I was going to say,
but I think it's okay.
We might get in trouble.
Yeah, Jessica's not recording this part of it. So, so yeah, no, I think that's fair use.
Fair use, I was going to say, yeah.
They may push back on it, but I think it's fair use. So, yeah, so there is ways to do that. The other thing that you could do is, if they don't have a copy, but you have a couple of pages, that using Zoom or whatever teleconferencing form you use, you could share it on the screen, and then students could see it that way. Yet another option would be if you import a page into, say, like a Google Whiteboard or a Google Jamboard, you could actually draw on the page, right? So if you wanted to like circle things or underline things or draw arrows to make some things explicit, if you scan it and then input it into that program, you can actually annotate it, and then the students can see your annotations and then add annotations.
Yeah, that's a good idea. It sounds like it's something to kind of play around with.
Yeah.
To figure out what works for our particular situation.
Yeah. You can even do that. Say for example, you have like 4 panels and you want to think about sequencing. You know, imagine taking those 4 panels and kind of separating them and putting them at the bottom of a, you know, a Jamboard or something, and then ask the student to read the panels and put them in the order that they think they should go in.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
You know, and then they can say, oh, well, the character said this, then the character said this, then the character said this, and then the character said this. So this is the order that I would put them in.
Eric, I like the idea too of even if you get 1 copy, just to see if your student will take to it, right? Because maybe not
Right.
every student will. And so
Right.
just starting slowly, and even if you just have 5 minutes of every lesson, let's go through the graphic novel together and then try that out.
Right. It's not for everybody.
Yeah.
Right? And for some people, it's like bourbon, right? You have to sip it a few times before you're like, oh, this is actually good. And then there's like really expensive ones. So it's exactly like bourbon. You know? I have to say, I still don't really like bourbon. But.
Yeah.
You know, I'm looking, there are lots of ones on immigration.
Yes. Yeah. So I think, but as you said, so within that, you're going to have to find ones that have the amount of text that makes sense for where your student is right now. Yeah.
So, you know how you were talking about the with the baseball player one, the fancy bubbles with the word. It turns out that my student, my basic literacy student, his son is somebody who does lettering in like you know, DC Comics and other kind of graphic novels. They have awards. They have like a whole awards for, you know, just for that, you know, the styling of the words like that. I had no idea.
Yeah.
It's really cool.
Yeah. They're finding forever on comic books on the cover, it would tell you the artist and the author of that issue, right? If they were different people. Then they started putting the colorist on the cover, right? Because that actually really matters, right? How good a job of the person colors. Just recently, letterers have been fighting to get their name on the cover of the comic as well. You know, although I cannot tell you that when I was a kid, and when I was a kid, at one point I had like 10,000 comics, and that's not hyperbole. I literally had like 10,000 comics. I could have listed artists and writers till the end of the day. I could name 1 letterer. Like I just didn't know from letterers, but, and I still
we're credited.
Yeah, but it matters, right? I mean, it definitely matters. When I try to make my own comics, my lettering stinks. I'm not like, my lettering's terrible. My handwriting's terrible. So if I ever make my own comic, I need to hire an actual letterer.
Eric, do you think Mad Magazine had a little more influence than some other comics in terms of getting graphic novels where they are?
Well, I think the interesting thing about Mad Magazine is because it was monthly, to go back to the current events question, it was able to satirize popular culture kind of like as it was happening, and sort of political culture as it was happening. And there's not really a replacement for it, right? I mean, it really sort of limped along for a while, and it's not really, I don't think it's published anymore. I think
I don't think so either.
I think a couple years ago they finally stopped publishing it. But Mad Magazine is an interesting, if you look at the history of Mad Magazine, the first decade in the 50s, the intended reader was clearly somebody that was like college educated or like an older adult. It was not at all for kids. The depth of references that Mad artists drew on was really, really rich. And then over time, it became a little bit less complicated, but those early Mad comics are really, really interesting. Hopefully you've moved from a 4 or a 5 to a 3 in your knowledge of graphic novels, and that you'll continue to move up that scale.